Good, good morning. It's Monday, April 11th, 2022. It's 10:07 a.m. and we're having a meeting of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee to continue our work on H715, an act relating to the clean heat standard. We have two things scheduled for this morning. The first is that based on edits received over the last week, our counsel, Ms. Chakowski, has prepared a strike all amendment incorporating those changes. And over the weekend, the administration put together proposals of amendment that we will go through after we finish walking through the changes received to date. And my hope is that we can come to a meeting of the minds in the next 2 days and have a bill that we can vote out that all parties can support. So that's the big picture. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Chakowski to walk us through the latest version of the bill, please.
Sure, and Ellen Chakowski, Office of Legislative Counsel. I will share my screen momentarily after Jude gives me the ability to do so. But today posted on the website is draft 1.2 of the strike all amendment. You will see in it that nearly all of the bill is the same. The changes have been highlighted in yellow. So I did a strike all because there's just a handful of very small specific ones. Hey, Jude.
Oh, yeah, would you like to share the screen?
Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but yes, please.
I'm trying to get by.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask Ms. Chakowski, how long have you been waiting to say that to Jude?
I actively try to avoid it normally. Okay. So the first change is on page 5. It's in subsection 3. And this is in 8123. So it's the first section of the new chapter. It's a small word change that was requested by the chair. So any downward adjustment of the annual requirements shall be allowed for only a short temporary period. Previously, the word temporary actually was specified period, but that was a change requested by the chair. So the next change is on page 8. So in subdivision, in subsection D, equitable distribution of clean heat measures. This is actually a proposed change from me. Subdivision 2 was one long paragraph, and I am proposing not to change any of the language in this paragraph, but to break it out into smaller paragraphs so that it's easier to read. Next, there's two changes under the default delivery agent subsection, which is on page 9. And these were proposed by the group working with Mr. Duvall, and he proposed these last week. So in subsection 2, line 15, the commission shall designate the default delivery agent. The default delivery agent shall be a single statewide entity capable of providing a variety of clean heat measures and contracted for a multi-year period through a competitive procurement process. Previously, the word was hired for a multi-year process. So this was a change that was requested. The entity selected as the default delivery agent may also be a market participant, but shall not be an obligated party.
How does, because this is one of the areas where we got some objection from the public. How does that work? So a fuel dealer will not be eligible?
A fuel dealer that is an obligated party will not be eligible.
Okay. Are there fuel dealers who are not obligated parties?
Potentially, yes.
How does that work?
So it's obligated parties are those who have the first point of sale within the state. And so if they're working with a wholesaler who is in the state and is the first point of sale in the state, those who are underneath the wholesaler in the chain will not be obligated parties.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
You may continue, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so the next change is all the way down in page 12. So now we're in the section on tradable clean heat credits. So subdivision B, clean heat credits shall be based on the life cycle CO2e emission reductions that result from the delivery of clean heat measures to end-use customer locations in or into Vermont. For clean heat measures that are installed, the value of the clean heat credits shall be the life cycle CO2e emission of the heating fuel use that is avoided by the installation of the measure, minus the life cycle CO2e emission of the energy that would have been used instead. And so this was language that was proposed by Mr. Duvall and his group. Next, on page 13, there's some minor, there are some changes again from Mr. Duvall's group. So eligible clean heat measures delivered to or installed in Vermont shall include the installation of thermal energy efficiency improvements and weatherization, the supply of sustainably sourced biofuels, renewable natural gas, green hydrogen, the installation of cold climate heat pumps and efficient electric appliances providing thermal end uses, the installation of advanced wood heating appliances and systems, and renewable energy-based district heating services.
And I think in conversation, one of the things we ended up discussing, but was subsequent maybe to, or during that walkthrough with Mr. Duvall and others, was striking the phrase in 6, the installation of, because the reason, as I recall it, was mere installation doesn't mean you're using it. So that the measure would be advanced wood heat or advanced wood heating. So I think the proposal I've heard since then is, so let me float this out to the committee, to strike the installation of, and then appliances and systems becomes more specific. There's the other consideration for advanced wood heat is what kind of fuel are you using? So if we just say advanced wood heating, then we capture the whole concept. So McDonald or Senator McCormick, any thoughts on that one? Because I would suggest making that change as we pass through this section.
I think that's better language. That's good language. That's a good change.
Okay. Senator McDonald, are you okay with that?
Yep.
Okay.
So do you just want to strike it in section 6, in subsection 6?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear you.
So just in subsection 6, or what about 1 and 5?
Thank you. Let me. It seems to me, others may have other thoughts, that it makes sense to take them all out I mean, installation is not not mere installation that we're interested in, but we're interested in thermal energy efficiency improvements. We're interested in cold climate heat pumps and efficient electrical appliances. I mean, I think for consistency's sake, I don't see a reason not to take all the instances out. But Mr. Walsh, you have a thought? We're in editing mode, so.
If you're open to thoughts from the peanut gallery, for the record, Ben and Julie Walsh from Beeford. From our perspective, it actually makes sense to keep the, Sorry about that. Ben and Julie Walsh from Beeford. From our perspective, it makes sense to actually keep the phrase the installation of in 1 and 5 here, while I agree with the logic that you laid out on and 6. And essentially that's because for 1 and 5, in that thermal efficiency, which just literally eliminates the need for a certain amount of energy use in a home or building, and 5, which is electrical appliances, cold climate heat pumps, water heaters, those fuels, or lack of fuels in the case of 1, are much more known going into the installation. In 1, there will be a sort of assessed or deemed amount of energy that would be avoided. And so crediting based on the installation of that, because you know that for the life of the installed measure, makes sense. Similarly for heat pumps and other efficient electrical appliances providing thermal end uses, there are legal requirements in the electric sector for a certain schedule of renewability in the electric sector in terms of the electricity that's being provided and will be used by those. And so that's, the PUC can know going into an installed measure, this is how much the average heat pump is going to use, and this is the electricity we'll be using. The last thing I'll say is that is different than 6 here, where you could actually see different fuel sources, different feedstocks happening year to year or month to month in a wood heating appliance. And so giving the PUC the latitude to make a determination on whether it's the installation of the measure or the actual supply of the biomass itself in the instance of advanced wood heating makes sense, where it just doesn't in the same way for the electrical and efficiency install measures.
Okay. Well, we have
Thank you.
Outside expertise from the department and the agency. I don't know if you want to offer a remark on this one. Sure. Mr. Brewer, thank you. Yeah, we might be doing musical chairs a little bit today, but better to edit and conclude and keep moving.
That was always terrible at the game as a kid. Way better here. TJ4 from the Department of Public Service. I think it could be workable either way. The word installed is in the leading sentence into those sub-provisions. Yeah. So I think, and I don't have it in front of me here, but I think it works to take it out, and the nuance that Mr. Walsh was talking about, I think is important, but I think it is addressed with that leading sentence. And I think the commission would be able to understand the intent of the policy, although you would need to ask them. But in implementing this and what is ultimately eligible, I think they could parse this section in particular.
Okay. Well, the department, thank you for pointing it out. You know, the Department of Redundancy Department, since it is in the lead-in language, I'm not sure that the value of saying it a second time. So, a little extra room. Thank you, Ms. Newman. All right, so my suggestion for the time being, and we'll have another bite at the apple, is to in 1, 5, and 6, just remove the phrase and rely on installed up front, as you say, the intelligence of the PUC, and to figure out how to deal with it. And then we would also be striking appliances and systems in 6. Thank you, everyone. So, did you catch that, Ms. Chakowski?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so back to you for walking us through. I do have, I'll wait till you get there.
Okay, down at the bottom of page 13, we're still on the same topic. So to promote certainty for obligated parties and clean heat providers, the commission shall, by rule or order, establish a schedule of life cycle emission rates for heating fuels and eligible clean heat measures. The schedule shall be based on transparent and accurate emissions accounting, adapting the Argonne National Laboratory GREET model, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Modeling, or an alternative of comparable analytical rigor to achieve the thermal sector greenhouse gas emissions reductions necessary in order to meet the sector's share of the requirements of 10 VSA 578A, to accurately account for biogenic and geologic emissions, and to deter substantially unintended harmful consequences.
I would like to request a change and share it with the committee, those present. So in line 6, accurately account for biogenic and geologic emissions, which I didn't know quite what we were talking about the first time through and the second time through, to suggest that it read accurately account for emissions attributable to biogenic and geologic sources. So we're accounting for emissions and we're naming where they come from.
What's a biogenic or geologic emission?
So biogenic is in biology based, as in biofuels, wood. Geologic, a little opaque, things like fossil fuels coming out of the ground. Coal, oil, propane.
Yeah, fuels made by a human is biogenic.
Fuels made by
A human,
humans?
yeah.
Now I'm confused. That's not what the prefix means. Bio refers to living things.
I thought it was a little less specific, like things that basically grew. So
Yeah,
you would take into account trees or soybeans.
I make the distinction, it's
Sure.
that fuels that are in the carbon of which is in the carbon cycle, as opposed to fuels that use otherwise isolated carbon. What's the word? There's a word that's always used, quarantined or something like that. I'm having an old man moment. You know what sequestered. That it's by carbon that's in the carbon cycle as opposed to sequestered carbon.
All right, yeah, I'm wrong.
All right. Well, the word's right, and now we're all squared away in the meeting. So
Is this stuff that hasn't gone into the ground and been preserved for a while and then dug back up? And it's stuff that's used as fast as it grows and it becomes available? Is that what we're talking about?
The carbon in trees goes up into the sky one way or another as smoke, or as what Robert Frost called slow fire, which is to say rotting, and then comes back down, and it keeps going round and round. It's the carbon cycle, as opposed to sequestered carbon that, if it weren't for industrial human activities, would remain safely in the ground, not bothering anybody.
yeah.
The theory is that biofuels do not
Fuels versus
add
bio-
to the sum total of atmospheric carbon.
All right, so I think we're set there.
Well, it's a questionable theory. That's the problem. There are people who disagree.
Are you all set, Senator McDonald? I don't want to go ahead if you're uncertain.
I can go back later.
Okay. All right, so Mr. Kowski, back to you.
Sure, and that change was requested by Mr. Duval and Company, so perhaps you can hear from them if you'd like. The next change is on page 16. So now we're in the section on the technical advisory group. So one change that I made, and I can undo it if you would prefer, is that I think we have been referring to the technical advisory group as the TAG. And so I added that reference throughout just to save space, but I can undo that if you would prefer to have the reference always be to the technical advisory group. But there's new language in subdivision 3. So the duties of the TAG shall include periodically assessing and reporting to the commission on the sustainability of the production of clean heat measures by considering factors including greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration and storage, human health, land use changes, ecological and biodiversity impacts, groundwater and surface impacts, air, water, and soil pollution, and increases in food costs.
Great. And I think that is, to me, that seems helpful because we heard testimony last week about taking a broader view and of what we meant by sustainable, and also getting more specific about what elements ought to be taken into consideration. Senator McDowell?
The last, and increases in food costs. And we're talking about using the land to produce something other than food. And one of the consequences would be that food costs go up. That's what we're talking about here.
Right. There's the concern over displacing crops for consumption with crops for combustion. Or, yeah.
So we're interested in, we're worried about not having enough food. And we're saying we're worried about food being too expensive. Which of the two are we worried about? We're not talking about the cost of surface water and the cost of groundwater. Okay.
Okay. Well, we could make it more neutral. It's true, the way it reads. It could be, and impacts.
Displacing food production, or?
We don't know what it's going to have to cost, but this presumes an increase, right? So does it help if it says impacts on food costs?
Is it the costs or the actual production? Leave it alone, we'll keep going.
So next on page 17.
Okay. So could we make that change to impacts on? It just seems more neutral. Otherwise, we're presuming an increase. It impacts on lets it go either way, and it puts the same topic on the table. We don't want people having trouble getting food because now there's more energy production, energy crops growing. Or that's a discussion to be had.
Okay.
Thank you.
So on page 17, there's new language in the membership of the TAG. So members of the TAG shall be appointed by the commission and shall include the Department of Public Service, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and parties who have or whose representatives have expertise in one or more of the following areas: technical and analytical expertise in measuring life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, energy modeling and data analysis, clean heat measures and energy technologies, sustainability and non-greenhouse gas emissions, strategies designed to reduce and avoid impacts to the environment, delivery of heating fuels in cold climates, and climate change mitigation policy and law. The commission shall accept and review motions to join the tag from interested parties who have or whose representatives have expertise in one or more of the areas listed in this subsection. So again, this was language that was requested by Mr. Duval and company. And it shifts to asking for the members of the tag to have expertise in these subject matter areas, as opposed to providing a list of entities who shall be represented on the group, in the group.
All right, so if we could pause for a moment, Mr. Duval, you have your hand up, you want to join the table? Put yourself into the record for the first.
Thank you, Chair Bray. For the record, my name is Jared Duval, member of the Vermont Climate Council. I just, as we're going through, wanted to note in sub 10, I think it should read to the tag rather than to tag, just so we catch that.
Okay. Takes a village. And Mr. McNamara, do you want to join us and jump in here too? Thank you.
Thank you, Ed McNamara, General Counsel for Agency of Natural Resources. I know we're going to go through other edits. I just, while we're here,
Sure.
instead of Department of Environmental Conservation, agency would recommend Agency of Natural Resources. There is a climate office that's being formed at the agency, and it's likely to sit in between departments given the cross-departmental nature of the issues.
Okay.
So I just want to recommend that.
Thank you. So, Mr. Kowski, can you swap out DEC and put in ANR? Thank you.
Okay. So next, at the bottom of page 19, now we're in the section on the Equity Advisory Group. So sub 6 reads, the duties of the Equity Advisory Group shall include providing information to the commission on the challenges renters face in being equitably served by clean heat measures and recommendations to ensure that renters have equitable access to clean heat measures. Next on page 20, there is a new section.
Before we go on, so I just want to note, I think for myself, I'm going to be rereading and thinking more about 8126 as a section based on, I think there's a lot of, solid on-point language. I don't know that it needs any more rewriting, but I guess I want to flag while we're passing it. I had a number of conversations since last week where there was, I think, concern that equity not be sort of a siloed consideration that is only consulted on some sort of irregular interval, that equity considerations become an integral part of the entire process. And so I just wanted to highlight that in passing, and I'm going to be thinking, and I invite everyone else to think about the same thing. I think one of the things where the Environmental Justice Bill addressed this, that one of our challenges with equity is that sometimes we do our best, but it becomes a sort of a brief transient effort that doesn't necessarily become integral to the process from start to finish. And I think that's the goal of equity, that it becomes integral to it. So just noting that in passing, and let's go back to your edits. Ms. Chakowski, thanks.
So on page 20, there is a new section that's being added to the chapter on clean heat. Section 8127 is a severability clause. It reads, if any provision of this chapter or its application to any person or circumstance is held invalid or in violation of the Constitution or laws of the United States, or in violation of the Constitution or laws of Vermont, the invalidity of the violation shall not affect the provisions of this chapter that can be given effect without the invalid provision or application. And to this end, the provisions of this chapter are severable. And this was requested by the chair.
Okay, and that comes out of our testimony with Mr. Hand and the Attorney General's office last week. I mean, the notion of including it, even though it's wherever, 9 VSA 3064, it has it as a default or something. Okay, thank you, Mr. Kowski.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator McCormick.
I don't want to take up too much time on this, but I've supported anytime any bill has ever had a severability clause in it, I've supported that. It makes sense that, but I've always wondered and as I say, it's almost a side trip and I don't want to take up, but it seems to me that isn't that up to the court? Can we really tell a court how it has to decide a case? Maybe that's a dirty trick on council there, to throw that out. At some point, I'd like to explore just the whole idea of severability clauses in a bill. It seems to me that that's actually that the court should have the option of simply not going with that.
So first, I do want to say that the Vermont statutes have an automatic severability clause applied to them because there's language in 1 VSA 215 that provides a severability clause automatically. Some bills do require that, do include them specifically for extra protection. You maybe don't need this, but if people feel more comfortably having it, you certainly can do that. And I don't necessarily agree with the premise of the question you just asked because.
Okay, well, I'm not sure I do either. It's something I'm wondering about.
Were there to be litigation around the enactment of this bill and its implementation, the court could strike down an individual section and the rest of the legislation would stand. That would be if there was a specific section of this bill that was unconstitutional. It wouldn't lead to the repeal of the entire bill, just the sections that have been found to be unconstitutional.
Right. Well, that's what severability is.
Right.
What I was wondering, it seems to me that okay, well, I mean, that's, as I say, this was sort of a side trip. We want to get back to marking up the bill. Thanks, Ellen.
Onward.
Okay, on page 21, now we're in section 3 of the bill, which is the session law provision that lays out the implementation steps that the PUC will follow. So the first, and so these changes that you'll see in this section were requested by the PUC. So first, public engagement process. The commission shall use the forms of public engagement described in this subsection to inform the design and implementation of the clean heat standard. Any failure by the commission to meet the requirements of the section shall not affect the validity of the commission's action. So the PUC requested this language. This is to prevent failure in the public engagement process from preventing the implementation of the clean heat standard.
it's a little bit awkward and off-putting to read. Because on the one hand, it says they have a requirement, and then any failure to meet the requirements shall not affect the validity of the action. I know their explanation, Mr. Marinello's explanation, I thought was completely reasonable. Like sounded like their concern was that despite their best efforts at outreach, they could miss people in terms of notifying them of the proceedings. And then that party might say, well, you didn't meet your requirements in terms of engagement. And then it could throw into question all the other work. And I get how this addresses that, but I'm still a little uncomfortable with it because it's so broad. I don't know if there's a way to fine tune that a little bit. And I don't want to problem solve on the way through, but for myself, that one still feels a little awkward. Okay, so Mr. McNamara, do you want to chip in? Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, Ed McNamara, just to be clear, this is not, this popped in my head. You could limit it to some degree by saying specific procedural requirements. And so, for example, that could address if a public hearing, if one of the public hearings had a procedural defect in it, it would not invalidate the entire thing. Just throwing that out there, trying to be helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. Writing it down on my copy. All right, so, yeah, Mr. Kowski, if we can continue on at 10 again, I guess.
Well, so wait, do you want to make a change there?
Well, yes, I would like to make a change. I just don't know what it is. Mr.
Oh, okay.
McNamara, you know, the phrase specific procedural requirements. And so I think rather than wordsmith it right now, if you could maybe just record that phrase, think about it yourself. You may have another way. I think you know what the concern I'm expressing is, that it's just too broad.
Okay, we may need to talk because I'm not entirely sure what you are going for there, but I can think about it.
Okay, thank you.
Too sweeping an exemption.
Yes, that's it.
But are you looking to allow them this? I mean, all right, I guess I'll have to think about it because do you want them, what is it you want to protect them from or require? Which of the steps in this long process are things that you would want to not validate?
I would want to be careful in editing, so rather than shooting from the hip here, but I think the general concept that Mr. Landis-Marinello presented was they were worried about they might not reach a party through their communications efforts despite their best efforts. And someone who hadn't received notice might then subsequently claim that the process was invalid because they didn't include that individual or those persons. And I don't know how it's a sort of an impossibility to expect that they would contact every individual in the state. So at what point do they, say we made a reasonable effort and there even so a quote-unquote procedural defect resulted, but the work isn't invalidated by that procedural defect. Along those lines, does anyone in the room want to contribute on that one? Okay, so we'll go on and see what the next.
How is this different? I mean, how is this different from other pieces of legislation that have procedural requirements in them? I mean, it seems to me that worry could apply to any procedural requirement. It would seem to me that a de minimis frivolous complaint, the court would treat as frivolous and de minimis. And a serious complaint would get some attention.
So my sense is that that the commission's, anyone who's running a process is always subject to that kind of complaint. And
Yeah.
that what's going on in this one that I think is different is that the public engagement process is a very large and explicit piece of it. And so because it's more comprehensive, I think, than almost any other expression of public engagement I've ever seen before, they're a little concerned about whether or not they're going to be able to dot every I, cross every T. And so they're asking for language to allow for some leniency, I suppose.
Rather than putting in the extra language calling for leniency, what about taking a look at the wording of the requirement and using phrases that people always hate, including me, but things like shall make reasonable efforts.
Right, so I think, all right, so I think we understand what we're aiming for. And rather than rewrite on the fly, give Mr. Kowski a chance to revisit. Mr. Kowski, do you feel like you understand well enough the committee's concern to be able to work on language there?
No, but here's what I will say. So the PUC made a number of specific requests in this section, and the chair requested that only a few of the changes be made. So the PUC requested that basically all or almost all of the shalls in this section be changed to mays. But this section does not reflect that because the chair just did not ask for those changes to be made. So, but you only just discussed notice requirements. So I think if your concern is just about giving proper notice, that is down further in this section about all of the specific parties or types of parties that need to be noticed. So that's one thing to consider. But then there's also these three kinds of meetings that the PUC needs to hold. And so do you want to provide leniency in the types of meetings that the PUC actually needs to hold? So that's another option that I think is part of this.
Okay, so this to me feels like a productive thing for us to buy time for ourselves, think about it, and revisit the language as opposed to try to sort it out in a group edit on the fly. So thank you. Let's keep going. And I'm putting a flag on this page to come back to it.
Sure, and by way of example here in subdivision 1, so the commission shall hold at least 6 public meetings, 3 of which that shall allow members of the public to participate in person and remotely. The meeting shall be held in at least 6 different counties of the state. The meeting shall be recorded and publicly posted on the commission's website. So the bill as passed by the House read that all 6 public meetings had to be hybrid public meetings. The PUC in their comments last week requested that only 1 of the meetings be a hybrid meeting that allowed both in-person and remote participation. And so the chair asked to split the difference and go with 3 meetings.
So the worry here is, I guess, is the wording that allow members of the public, that someone might say that the commission didn't really allow members of the public to participate because it didn't give enough notice.
So I think
their concern was over technology. I think in part they weren't sure they were going to be able to host all these meetings as hybrid meetings. I'm not sure why. So as often I'll do, I split the difference and said, okay, rather than We asked for, the bill asked for 6, they wanted 1. We came to 3, so that if you couldn't attend a meeting remotely on June 1st, because you're away, well, you could maybe get the June 7th one or the July 5th one, or who knows, you know, three opportunities to weigh in remotely. The other thing, Mr. Kowski, I marked my copy on line 11, that which allow, which that allow. I don't know if you want to strike the that, or the way you actually read it to us, which I think will allow. So whatever you want to do, it seems not quite right there.
Which I'm saying,
Which that?
At that.
Marty?
Okay,
3 of which that allow.
How about
meetings.
3 of which allow? 3 of which allow members of the public
All right.
would say it's fine.
okay.
3 meetings shall allow.
Thank you. Let's keep going. Now we're getting sucked into edit mode.
Yeah.
All right, so the implementation of this does require 6 public meetings, some of which need to be remote. It then does require these focus group meetings using deliberative polling. That's not changing. But then on page 22, the third type of meeting are these workshops to solicit input from potentially affected parties. So the changes are to reach as many potentially interested entities as possible, such as Vermont fuel wholesalers and retail fuel suppliers, renewable energy advocacy organizations, environmental and consumer advocacy organizations, organizations that specialize in serving low and moderate income Vermonters, organizations that specialize in serving older Vermonters, entities that provide weatherization services, energy transition providers, regional planning commissions, municipal energy commissions, community action agencies, environmental justice organizations, financial institutions that specialize in implementing low-income financing programs, affordable housing advocates, the Office of Economic Opportunity and Regional Development Corporations. The Commission shall provide notice of the workshops on its website, shall publish the notice once in a newspaper of general circulation in each county of Vermont, and shall also provide direct notice to any person that requires direct notice or to whom the Commission may consider direct notice appropriate. The Commission shall also provide an opportunity for submission of written comments, which the notice shall include.
Thank you. So the newspaper, just by way of conversation, the newspaper bit was that we want to make sure that even though more and more things are happening electronically, that there are still people who rely on traditional ways of keeping up with the news, like a newspaper.
Next, in subsection D, draft order. The Commission shall publicly publish a draft order and provide notice of it to the stakeholders who registered their names and email addresses with the Commission during the workshops. And so this is clarification because it just previously said the stakeholders who attended the workshops. And then down at the bottom of page 23, there are 2 reports that are required from the PUC before the order is actually adopted. And so they're in the January of 2023 and 2024, where they check back in with the legislature. And so there's language added on line 18 calling these now check back reports.
And while we're here, I'd like to propose a change to the January 15, 2023 date. In consultation with Secretary Moore over the weekend, the administration has already a proposal to move that to March. And I shared with the secretary my concern that because legislative action might follow on the basis of the report, that was late in a legislative session to receive the report. I think the concern, as I understood from the administration side, was it was a January 15th report when the program was only started roughly 4 months before is so quick that they may not have much information. So again, sort of the splitting of the difference, I'd like to propose that we change the date to February 15. That way we will have enough time if we move right along for both House and Senate to look at a bill and move something that would affect the implementation. Is everyone fine with that? Okay.
Which date are you moving, Mr. Chair?
Just the first one. So next winter to have the January 15 report become a February 15 report. Fine. Those who have to write it, an extra month. The program really only gets underway in the fall. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so there's new language added to this report section. So the reports are due to the committees of jurisdiction, and it's going to be a written report and testimony before the committees detailing the efforts undertaken to establish the clean heat standard pursuant to this chapter, and to the extent available, estimates of the impacts of the clean heat standard on customers, including impacts to customer rates and fuel bills for participating and non-participating customers, fossil fuel reductions, and greenhouse gas reductions. The modeled impacts shall estimate high, medium, and low price and greenhouse gas reduction impacts.
Thank you. So I think the administration shared that language last week. And my understanding is there's further revision since, but the idea was to make the report include more information that would inform the legislature in such a way that it could respond to the developing program and perhaps consider making changes to the program. It's unanticipated consequences. Want to say anything? I know we're going to see more.
If you'd rather, I can hold off.
Okay, let's go through the new language all at once then. Thank you. All right, thanks, Mr. Kowski.
So that's the last change.
So any second thoughts, questions, comments on what we just reviewed and basically approved for the strike off as further amended? Good morning, Senator Westman. All right, not seeing or hearing any. Senator McDonald?
The PUC may do by rule or order, back on page 13. I'm wary of the PUC issuing orders before I want to know what sort of things the order would be they can do. Just like hire somebody or cut off someone's head. Two extremes.
So let's talk about that when we you and I met with Ms. Chakowski for Friday afternoon. I think the first instance of by rule or order begins back on page 3, right at the outset. So where it creates that discretion. And so Senator McDonald, do you want to restate again why we might consider adjusting
We're asking,
the rule?
we're asking the PUC to put together a plan that enough people are skeptical enough to want to have a check back on. That will deal with our energy future. And the rule process is a chance to see whether they've done what they've been asked to do. When they do it by order, it kind of is a real shortcut. So what is it that these orders would permit them to do before the rule comes out, or in lieu of a rule, and before the legislature has the check back time? What's their leash under which they're operating?
So, Ms. Chakowski, can you talk to us some about the consequences of doing this through order versus doing it through rule, please?
Sure. So the chapter in statute that's being added on the clean heat standard does reference throughout the PUC having the ability to adopt parts of the program either in rule or order. However, section 3 of the bill lays out an order process. So it's directing them to make the initial the initial program adopted via order. And there is a pretty, as I just walked through some of it, there's a pretty detailed process that the PUC needs to go through, including a detailed public engagement process involving multiple kinds of engagement with the public and stakeholders. It requires a draft order to be published and allowed for public comment on the draft order before it's adopted. But it also includes those 2 checkback reports that come to the legislature, including written report and testimony before the committees of jurisdiction. And so while technically orders don't require the same strict adoption procedure that rulemaking requires, this process that's set up in section 3 that was worked on by the House contains nearly all of the same elements that rulemaking requires, just in slightly different form. Now, if you wanted to go with a rulemaking process, I think you could do that. But the House chose specifically to go with an order and then built out this public engagement process and then check-in process with the legislature.
And what's the, so in order, if a rule's issued, it goes to LCAR. So there's an opportunity for the legislature to evaluate and weigh in. If the
they're still going through their changes from last week.
I don't know who it is. I think it's Secretary Morris. Here we go. Thank you. If an order is issued, is there a formalized legislative check-in normally, or it would just go and have force of law, and our only sort of means of weighing in would be to review the order and then through statute, direct something else to occur that would change the order.
Right. Normally, I don't believe there's a legislative check-in with an order. Orders can be issued much more quickly and amended much more quickly than a rule, because rules are required to use the process established in statute under the Administrative Procedures Act. So they can be amended and changed much more quickly. However, as I just mentioned, there are checkback points added in this legislation. There's also a third check-in that occurs after the order has been issued in August of 2024, so that the PUC has to provide information on what they've actually adopted in the order. And that is before the order is to take effect in January of 2025.
So the challenge I can foresee in that process is if in that late stage, the finalized order were to reveal something that the legislature thought was, it did not want to see happen, then we're not in session. And actually, so if it's 25 that's coming into, yeah, the current legislature would be in the middle of, we would have adjourned for the year. So we don't really have a way to act as a legislature. And then it comes online on January 1 of 25. So 4 or 5 days before the next legislature is sworn in, it becomes active. So I think that's the concern that I discussed some with Senator McDonald before we came to visit with you. Our ability to stay engaged and influence the nature of the program. So, while respecting, so let me add quickly, while respecting the work of the PUC and all the partners that have developed it. It's not like I'm not arguing for micromanagement. I'm arguing for providing an opportunity to engage. So Senator McDonald, what would you add?
Mr. Chair, I keep going back to the last time we had such a situation where the PUC was asked to do some studies and make some recommendations about net metering and electricity, etc. And the legislature was reluctant. And the legislature demanded a check back. And the statute called for a check back. The statute also said, after the PUC has presented the legislature what it plans to do in rule, then if the legislature says okay, the PUC can do it by order. That was the process. Work, do your study, make a recommendation, check back with the legislature. Legislature says, okay, you can do it by order and you don't have to stretch it out for 6 or 9 months on rule. Well, PUC ignored the check back. They blew right past it, didn't do a damn thing. Legislature adjourned. And then the PUC made its recommendation by order. A flagrant go around. The LCARS said the rules that they have promulgated violate the law. The LCAR committee said no. And they said, well, all the utilities in the state of Vermont reprogram their computers left, right, and sideways, and you're gonna turn the apple cart upside down. And we swallowed and we ate it. That's what happened when the PUC had an opportunity to do something by order after a check back. And they just blew it up. So what prohibits that from happening again? No, they have to do some orders to hire people and do their studies in order to provide the information for the rules procedure, or to present to the legislature, that's one thing. But allowing them to use the order to override the rules procedure, and it's not in order.
So
I don't, maybe one of these situations is okay to hire and put out contracts to get the information, but acting on it and with the force of law for the program that we're designing would be a greater delegation power to them than the rulemaking power.
So
Which-
this is sort of a once burned, twice cautious thing. Right. So I don't, without going into the whole net metering thing anymore, other than to say you had that experience, then, or we had that experience, I should say you, sorry, then, and other people might characterize it differently. Either way, the point's taken, and I think it's prudent to design a process where the legislature maintains its essential role as the lawmaking body in the design and implementation of the program, even if the program and the details of implementation are delegated to others with expertise. So, Ms. Chakowski, do you want to add anything else to this discussion now? We can, it's not something to resolve at the moment, but let me check in with committee members and just say, do you agree with the notion of, making this change, or at least exploring further this change of going to rulemaking for, as opposed to using an order for the implementation of the program ultimately? Right. So not hearing any objections to considering it further, let's work with council, Senator McDonald, and look at it further, how that would affect the bills, what it would look like to implement that. So with that, I'd like to transition over to hearing from members of the administration who I appreciate must have given us some of their weekend in order to have a draft on Sunday afternoon. Because I don't usually see, a draft in the evening, on Sunday evening. So, Mr. McNamara, welcome back to the chair. And I think everyone has, it's posted on our website, and every committee member has access to it there. Just to help people identify it, the version I'm looking at says in red across the top, bill is introduced and passed by the House, H 715. And then in the upper right-hand corner, PSD A&R suggested edits 4/10/22. So, Mr. McNamara, Mr. Duval.
Sorry, just a quick point of information question. I am looking at the website. My computer may be slow, but I'm not seeing.
I don't have it.
Okay, so we have technical wizards in the room.
Thank you. I was gonna tell them, but
Let me pause for a moment, because I don't know if it's on this machine, but I did receive a copy. So if I can pull it up right now, I'll send it to Jude. I thought it would come through.
I'll double check my email.
Well, let me see. So Secretary Moore is with us. Good morning, Secretary Moore. Can you send it directly to Jude, please?
I was gonna offer to do just that. Stand by.
Great, because it's going to happen faster if you do it than I try to find it.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Bob. I'll make sure everyone can follow along. All right, so. Okay, so let's start, and we'll need to wait. Here, I'll share my copy with you. I printed it out last night.
Great, thank you. And I will say that these were developed, Department of Public Service and A&R staff worked on this on Friday weekend. These are joint edits, proposed edits, and I'm going to touch on a couple of them, and Mr. Poor will touch on some of the other issues.
Okay.
So, last time I was here, I talked about the idea of a check back once costs are known, to then actually we come back to the legislature for final approval. There was some proposed changes to that language that I had submitted. And this is on page 3 of the bill. They would add a new, this is under Clean Heat Standard 8121, Clean Heat Standard generally. So it would add a new provision, either D or E, depending on what you're looking at. The commission shall design and implement the clean heat standard in a manner that minimizes cost to customers and recognizes that affordable heating is essential for Vermonters. So the point there is to simply note the importance of affordability in implementing this. It does not change any other aspect.
Can I ask a question about that? So I think it's 30 VSA 202A. Just isn't that our sort of fundamental three factors? We look at safety, reliability, lowest environmental impacts, lowest costs. So I was just, my thought as I read through last evening was to insert the phrase in a manner consistent with 30 VSA 202A, and then the rest of it flows on, because I don't know how we would ever give precedence to cost over the other factors, given that 202A is our underlying policy. So I don't know, you know this stuff much better than I do, but does that make sense, or how do you look at that?
I understand that. I guess my perspective is that there's nothing about cost at all anywhere in this bill. And so there was no perspective on one of the important 202A is the state's energy policy. And so I think adding sort of this cost component here doesn't really provide priority of affordability over meeting the requirements, does not alter the criteria by which the PUC would actually meet the requirements of GWSA and reduce GHG emissions from the thermal sector. It's saying do it, and do it in a way that is as affordable as possible.
Could that come at the expense of safety and reliability or environmental impacts? Because this puts the finger on the scale compared to those other 202A factors. I mean, that's a genuine question. I don't know how the two parts would interact.
I don't believe that it would. I think it's just giving a pretty clear direction to PUC that the legislature is concerned about costs, and notwithstanding all the other aspects that PUC needs to design a program to meet all the requirements, consider costs at the same time.
All right, so I don't want to belabor it. It almost seems like it creates a first amongst equals situation, but that said, would you be open to the notion of minimizes costs and maximizes benefits, so that we're acknowledging that there's both sides?
I think that is reasonable. I will also say that part of the reason for proposing this in particular is, as part of the GWSA, the term cost effective is used at least a number of times, including the climate action plan shall prioritize the most cost effective, technologically feasible, and equitable GHG emissions reduction pathways. And so it was simply noting that cost effective is a significant, I'm not sure I would go so far as to say first among equals, just because it's the first criteria listed, but I think it's a pretty significant issue that needs to be incorporated.
Sure, absolutely. I don't want to minimize it. I'm just trying to see how that reads within the pre-existing legal context.
So, Mr. Chair, this is, we've been dealing with this for 30 or 40 years. And every year we say we want to do something, we want to take a step forward, we want to reduce fossil fuels, but we have to take costs into account. And every time there's a proposal to make some changes, oh, that costs too much. That costs too much. 5 years after, that costs too much. Are you worried that cost isn't going to be in this discussion if these words aren't in here? Or is this just more of the same? Since this bill was introduced, the cost of gasoline has doubled.
And the cost of heating oil has increased.
Yeah, of course, the heating oil is doubled.
Yep.
So, and your goal is what?
The goal is to ensure that the PUC takes costs into account when designing the program.
Yeah, which is what they're hired to do.
So, and I think we're in, let's continue because I know there's quite a bit more coming, but
Yeah.
I hear both sides of the discussion. So we're on to E, I think it is. And just for people who are, Chairman McCormick, there is the version is listed, that Mr. McNamara is going through is listed under Secretary Moore's name on our website currently. So you can pull it up. Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's essential that we address the issue of affordability. It is the main argument that people make against the bill. And over the last 30 years, to which Senator McDonald has referred, it's the main argument that is offered against any efforts on dealing with global warming. And I think we have to address it, but I'm reluctant to just say if affordable or if not too expensive, because that opens a Pandora's box where pretty much anything we want to do, someone can say, well, this is too expensive. In the discussions I've been involved with constituents, in particular constituents who hate this bill because they think it's too expensive, is that the issue is not expense so much as regressivity, that it will have negative economic impacts on lower income people and middle class people. And that if we're going to do anything along the lines of changing the heating technology and similarly changing we're not dealing with transportation, but all the big changes we're pushing for to deal with global warming, that we have to figure out ways to make that affordable. For when the examples being that in the end, if you clean up your act and how you heat your house, in the end, you're going to save money, but it's front loaded. It's expensive to get into that kind of system in the first place, that we have to expedite lower income and middle income people meeting the economic burden. The idea that we simply should not require of people or have a system that encourages people to clean up their act on home heating because it's too expensive, I think is facile and irresponsible. But I don't think we can just happily and cheerily say to people, well, you can't afford it, but do it anyway. What we have to do is have that the part of the program is expediting the transition.
Okay. Well, and Mr. McNamara has agreed to adding and maximizes benefits. So I think that to me is implicit in terms of it acknowledges that there is a cost to business as usual. It means you're subject to having the price of your heating fuel double from time to time. And so we address both sides of the equation. So with that, Mr. McNamara.
We haven't addressed both sides of the equation for years. If the goal of this thing is this bill is to reverse the unaffordable policies of the last several decades. What we are doing is unaffordable. What we are doing is screwing people. What we are doing is like feeding them some kind of, opiate that just is from which we will not recover.
And I do think that there's a misunderstanding here that this language does not say if it's not affordable, don't do it. It says do the clean heat standard and do it in a way that maximizes affordability.
Well,
just to be really clear, we're not recommending that you change the requirements, simply recommending that you consider affordability in doing it. And I would say also, actually, no, sorry, stop there.
Okay. Well, obviously, it's of importance to everyone, those who support the bill, those who are worried about the bill. So let's continue on because I know you have many more edits.
The next one, E, it actually might be useful to look at page 26 first of the draft. And this is, you had up earlier some proposed language on on the reports. This is where you changed the timing to
I think, can you give,
February 15th.
can you give me, oh, all right, so the February 15th page?
Yes, exactly. The bottom of page 26.
Okay,
And this is the PUC reporting requirements.
okay. Are you at like draft order or?
Actually, number 1, and I apologize if we have a slightly different version.
Yeah, because the comments take up space, right?
Yeah. So it's actually on page 27. The 2023 report shall include modeled impacts of the clean heat standard on customers, including impacts to customer rates and fuel bills for participating and non-participating customers, fossil fuel reductions, and greenhouse gas reductions. Modeled impacts shall estimate high, medium, and low price and GHG reduction impacts. Based up, and this is, so that language you'd seen last week.
Okay.
Next sentence is new.
I think that's pretty much, I don't know if it's verbatim, but it's in there.
It's generally in there. The concern I have with the existing language is it says something about to the extent feasible or if available. This is saying PUC, you should know how to figure out or how to project costs. You shall do it.
Okay,
Not if you think you can do it, but
right.
so
What
I think that's
happens-
actually very significant.
Sure, okay. Yeah, I had mentioned to the secretary to the extent available, just because of my, so we're on page 28, 27, 28. The practical concern that 4 months or so into the program for the proposed February report, that they might not have that data yet. And so I was trying to give the room to say, yes, by the time we get to our 24 report, we will have all that. But in the early days, they won't get to know this stuff. So, but that's me worrying on their behalf. So maybe I'm worrying on their behalf, but in a way I don't need to.
And I would say this is modeled estimated impacts. This is not saying it will cost X, Y, or Z. They're saying here's a range of potential costs and benefits associated with the program, because that has not been produced to date. And I think that's an important component.
Okay.
So then the last sentence.
They already have some modeling done, right? I mean, I don't know about for clean heat, but there is the names have changed. I think of it as we had, I'm forgetting the name of its predecessor. It's not Reggie. There's a model that we pay a subscription for that does economic impact analysis, right? Remy, thank you. And then you all have been modernizing that or developing another model. And with EAM, you were working on a model. Is any of this modeling is there already a tool for them to use? Or are they going to be starting, I don't know if I should say from scratch next fall to be able to do the kind of modeling we're talking about?
So I would say that I'm not entirely sure where some of the GWSA work is on economic modeling. There's some modeling in there that the PUC may be able to pull from. There are REMI analyses. There's the PUC had done economic analysis associated with weatherization when they proposed an increase in the fuel tax 2 years ago, I believe. So they're not starting from scratch, I would say.
Okay.
I think something specific to this proposal is more.
Okay. All right, so we paused. You have a new sentence that you've added on here.
Yep. Based upon the information regarding projected costs, the commission shall recommend cost containment mechanisms to be included in statute. This is essentially saying, PUC, look at the costs, and then without actually changing any of the requirements, are there ways to contain the costs to the extent practicable?
You can't go back 3 years and weatherize something. So that's one way to do it.
Right.
But whoever estimated the costs and how they were gonna, contain the last 5 years and the last 10 years, we've been containing costs over and over again. In the last 6 weeks, the expenses have doubled and all the estimates have, weren't worse diddly. And we just keep saying, no, we're sitting there watching automobiles get purchased day after day. They get worse gas mileage than the year before. But we're not doing anything.
So, Mr. McNamara, Mr. Ford, so it would be helpful to me, I get the gist of cost containment mechanisms, but I don't really know what they are, or if we already have them in other programs. Can you help the committee understand what cost containment mechanisms are and what they might look like in a program like this?
Some of it could be, for example, actually, I'm just gonna let Mr. Porter respond.
I actually wondered if we should
Yeah, you
testify
can just-
together on these
yeah.
changes
Why don't
and
you
they
just
just
slide right in
come
there.
up, it might be, since we may be going back and forth a little.
Yeah.
And again, TJ Ford from Department of Public Service. And I think part of the genesis of this language is because we really don't know what we don't know. And so we want to make sure that there's mechanisms and that there's attention to affordability and costs like throughout and in the report, and that there's opportunity for the commission to recommend back to the legislature mechanisms that might improve the clean heat standard, that maybe they can implement them under the current rubric that's being contemplated, but also that they might need help, or they might need authorization to do. So I think a firm cost containment measure is something like a credit price cap or an alternative compliance payment. There are some things in the legislation that kind of get to that with the default delivery agent, but it's not a hard cap. And I think that's maybe one extreme of a cost containment measure. So it's a very hard, strict kind of, if you get up to here, it will not exceed X. And we do that in the renewable energy standard with, it essentially is the alternative compliance payment. There's also in the renewable energy standard mechanisms such as if costs are too burdensome, or if there's issues in complying, you can petition to the commission to actually the utilities can petition to the commission to not meet the commitment in 1 year and have that accrue later on. So those are just a couple of examples. There could be other cost containment mechanisms that direct certain resources to be prioritized in the clean heat standard. There could be other administrative containment mechanisms. Not suggesting that any one of those that I just suggested are the best idea or a good idea, even just trying to give some examples of things.
Okay, so practically speaking, in February, next February, should be here pretty soon. Are you expecting them to enumerate some considerations for cost containment mechanisms, or are you expecting sort of a fully fledged product? Like, we recommend you include an alternative compliance payment mechanism. I'm just wondering, my only concern is not that I think people would like to be cost effective, make sure it's affordable, all the rest. I just wouldn't want to set a target that's sort of unattainable, in the very first report? I don't know. Again, this is, you're much closer to all the operations of the Department of PUC, so.
Well, I think that the commission could, I think this language gives some discretion, I think, to, you know, either give that some hard mechanisms or say, you know, we don't know exactly what it is. We need authorization to do this in the future, as we see this moving forward.
Okay.
And so,
So I know, I mean, it is discretionary, right? You're saying they're recommending, they're not necessarily saying we've already made a decision that we're building this. Okay. And I suspect though, like any of these things, especially with something as complicated and new as this, that there'll be ongoing learning throughout the whole process. And that what it looks like in February 23 is not what it will look like in February 24. Maybe, I don't know. Okay, thanks, that's very helpful. All right, I'm just mindful of the clock, we have about 25 minutes, so make sure that we can hear all your.
you're going back to a great.
And so if we go back to page 3, there's a new section E. Upon receiving the recommendations regarding cost containment mechanisms provided by the commission, the General Assembly shall determine whether to enact legislation that adopts the commission's recommendations. So essentially, just requires the legislature to say, okay, thank you for those cost containment recommendations. We do not decide to implement them.
Okay.
And those recommendations are strictly related to cost containment.
Right. And what if it's, again, you know, so maybe I'm worrying about something I don't need to worry about. What if it's that it's so early and it's going that no one quite yet knows how the program is going to operate? And are we being asked to adopt the recommendations? I'm just worrying that it could be premature. We might say, yes, continue to explore it, as opposed to, settle on an ACP and just keep developing that way.
So the language was deliberately written in such a way that General Assembly shall determine whether to enact legislation. So it is up to the legislature what they would like to do with it. There is no mandate that the legislature accept.
Yeah. Okay. And it's, as you point out, it's important for me, for all of us to keep in mind, it's on the cost containment side.
That's correct.
Okay. Let's march forward from there.
Turn that over to Mr. Porter.
So on page 9 of the copy that I have in front of me, so it's subdivision D on equitable distribution of clean heat measures, subdivision 1. There's a suggested change in language here to have the design shall ensure all customers equitably participate in and benefit from clean heat measures and services regardless of heating fuel use, income level, etc. The previous language here was have an opportunity to participate in, and that is language that was is in tier 3 of the clean heat, tier 3, not of the clean heat standard, just in tier 3. And we found that the way that that has been interpreted is that a program is offered by a utility, and that means that everybody has opportunity to participate in it, whether or not they really actually can participate in it, right? You know, we're offering a program with $100 incentive for, a heat pump. You know, the incentives are higher than that. But that doesn't mean that there is an equitable opportunity for people to take advantage of that, whether it's the marketing or the financial incentive isn't enough. It's just not necessarily serving the breadth of Vermont customers. So this edit was an attempt to kind of better design the language to ensure that there is actual equitable participation. please.
Right, equal access is not equitable. Okay,
Right.
got it. Just above that, when it says minimizing adverse impacts to low-income Vermonters, are you open to the notion of putting in adverse impacts, if any, to Vermonters? Because again, this one seems to presume adverse impact.
Well, I don't know that if any changes it.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think I would oppose if any in there.
Well,
It depends on the design, I suppose,
Yeah.
but yeah.
well, I'm just, each time we worry about costs, I also want to recognize that there's benefits to the program, or so that we don't just sort of fall into a kind of a negative defensive mode on it, but keep our hopes and aspirations, you know, going at the same time.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
the last time Mr. Ford was here, he shared with us the notion that there are going to be winners and losers in this bill. And we asked him, when he testified, could he give us a list of the winners, a list of the losers? And he wasn't prepared at that time, but if we're gonna be mitigating impacts on Vermonters, we probably ought to know who the folks that are asking us to minimize the impact, tell us who they believe the winners and the losers are going to be. Because until you know who you believe are the winners and you believe are the losers, it's all just talk. So who are the losers going to be when this bill passes? Who are the winners going to be?
So similar to how I responded last time, is I think that it needs to be a broader discussion than just me answering that question. And I gave some examples of potential winners or losers. I could do that again, but that's not the breadth of them all. And so perhaps one is to have that be a consideration of the PUC proceeding, of who they are, because participants that are installing measures are likely to be winners. Anybody who bears a cost that is not participating is going to lose in this instance. How it plays out for different businesses, for different kind of regulated entities, overall, administration of a program, I think all that remains to be seen from the design. And I think my point in saying that is really just to raise again that we haven't regulated this industry before, and there's a lot that we don't know, and the PUC, I think a lot of the changes you'll see here, the PUC really needs to have some latitude to implement the clean heat standard in order to minimize complexity of it and minimize costs. And I will say to minimize costs and to maximize benefits.
Everybody believes minimizing costs and maximizing benefits. Nobody in this building would argue with that. But I ask you, if we do nothing, who are the winners and who are the losers under the current system? Everybody knows we want to maximize benefits and minimize costs. We've been saying that for 40 years. If we do nothing, who are the winners?
So
Yeah.
You're the expert in this area. That's why you're a witness. If we do nothing, who are the winners?
It depends on the frame that you're putting it around. It's relative to what? There's
Relative
winners and
to-
losers.
Doing nothing versus moving ahead with a clean heat bill. Who are the winners if we do nothing?
So it's inverse. So the non-participants under a clean, people who do not participate in the transition under clean heat standard are going to likely have less costs than if they would, but that, then there's like the social costs and benefits that need to be layered onto that as well. And so that's why we need to have a real analysis on what the costs and benefits are.
So, Senator McDonald, we're not gonna get to this now, and we're gonna have. to-
Well, we never do, Mr. Chair, and that's through no fault of your
Right.
own. The fossil fuel industry knows how to play this game, and they know who to speak to.
Well, so,
And year after year, the winners of the fossil fuel industry and the losers are the homeowners that buy fossil fuels. And if you can't get past that one, you're working for one side or you're working for the other.
Okay, well-
Or you're using words you can't define. So I'm
I think this,
I'm getting off my soapbox.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna be quiet.
well, we're not just, I'm not trying to quiet you down, I'm just, Mr. Portman.
Someone better.
Yeah, I was coming over there in a minute.
That's why she's here. No, for instance, Mr. Ford said, for instance, or maybe Mr. Beckner, I think it was Mr. Ford said, this notion of winners and losers could be part of the explicit directions and the analysis that the PUC brings forward, so that the program articulates just exactly how it will roll out. I think about the call I got from someone, a constituent who told me he thought that efficiency grant was the worst thing. He was being taxed on his electricity year after year after year. I asked him if he participated, and he said, well, maybe I got light bulbs. I said, well, I would call them. And I told him about incentives. He called me back 3 months later. He'd got a new freezer, all the light bulbs changed in his house, and he thought efficiency grant was the greatest program we'd ever invented. So the extent to which people are engaged and participate has a lot to do with their own benefits out of a program. And the other thing is, this is critically a voluntary program. Anything that wasn't voluntary would definitely not fly. So I take your point, and I think I'd love to see us build that into the request for information from the PUC. We might not call it winners and losers, but something that gets that on the table for analysis by the legislature as part of any kind of affirmation process to move it forward. Right. So, Mr. Poor, I think that brings us to page 10.
Yes. So on page 10, a new provision 3 is suggested in setting the percentage of clean heat measures that must be delivered to low income and moderate income customers. The commission shall take into account the uptake of other government-sponsored low-income energy subsidies to support clean heat measures. This is just another provision to ensure that the commission is considering the breadth of folks that are low and moderate income and that could deliver services. Elsewhere in the legislation, there's a requirement. I think it's 16% low income and 16% moderate income. And there's some estimates that low and moderate income are much higher than that 32%. So this provision just going to add some more consideration to ensuring that the clean heat measures are equitably distributed on an income basis.
And before we get too far, let me check in. I want to ask committee members, these seem like reasonable requests to me. I mean, I just want to have committees to check to see if you're willing to see these provisions built into our next draft and highlighted so that we'll see them in context with anything else. So it's not yes, we're accepting everything, but it gives us a chance to have an integrated single amendment to work on as a group. Anyone have an objection to doing that? I haven't seen it. I mean, obviously it's precipitating discussion, but I'm not seeing anything objectionable. We haven't asked counsel for any concerns from a legal standpoint yet. So, Ms. Chakowski, if you hear us discussing something where you feel like there's a point of law or construction of the bill that we should be keeping in mind as we discuss it, please speak up. Thank you.
Sure, so I actually don't understand the change here on page 10. Because what's being struck is a directive that the definition of low and income moderate customer line up with government sponsored low income definitions. But the language that's replacing it, and I don't understand the language that's replacing it that says shall take into account uptake of other government sponsored. Those two things, what's being struck and what's replacing it don't seem to be related. So I'm not sure.
Can I chime in here? This provision, the primary purpose of this proposed edit is to account for later on, Mr. Ford is going to be talking about modifying language so that the PUC can take into account or can decide after opportunity for lots of folks to weigh in how tier 3 and other measures shall interact with clean heat standard. The way this language was originally written, it essentially says if it's a targeted low income measure, regardless, it could be, for example, tier 3 has low income requirements. If it was a tier 3 low income requirement or a customer participating in that requirement, that would automatically get rolled into the clean heat standard. Here, it's simply part of that overall change of up to the PUC to make a decision about how different programs fit. Otherwise, that language would effectively declare it.
Okay, so that one I'm gonna have to learn more about how it actually works. So let's kind of flag that one as a question mark, not meaning no, meaning learn more before proceeding. Okay, and let's proceed.
Okay, so on page 14, there are some edits and those are within the language that Mr. Duvall's draft had suggested. Those are, and then I just asked to withdraw those edits because those are actually addressed later on separately. And the intent with this, and later on I'll explain it more in a second, was to, and there's a sidebar comment that explains it, and talking about the accounting that Efficiency Vermont presented the other day to you all on whether or not it's better to count the savings from measures annually, from the weatherization installation annually, or pull forward all of those savings to count them immediately. And later on, there's some language that we suggest that actually leaves that decision to the Public Utility Commission. And so the edits we suggested here are no longer necessary. Although Mr. Duvall's edits can
Right.
stay.
Okay, so the phrase you added that's new is over the life of the measures, which, right, and that precludes front loading. My understanding from participating in some of the meetings of the Clean Heat Standard Working Group was they looked at front loading versus not front loading. And I think this probably came up in the regs as well, but if you front load, you get so many credits so fast that you have less work done over time. It's like there's less area under the curve if you front load.
Right, so there's like you could do it one way or the other. You could also the commission's also setting the target. So if you're aware that you're front loading, you could set the target in a manner to ensure that the right amount of work is happening. And so, but instead of deciding that here, the proposal is to, because it gets really weedy and really technical really fast.
Yeah. And
so the proposal is to put that issue as one of the ones that the commission needs to address. And the edits that were made here previously by other advocates. I'm not sure how to reference you all. That is addressing a different issue and so that language is okay to stay, if I'm right.
Without your last.
Without the additions in the draft that we provided, the
Okay,
410 draft.
which just was over the life of the measures. So rather than putting your finger on the scale now, you're saying refer the issue to the PUC to decide front loading or not.
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Duval,
Just to pick up on.
you can stay right there. We'll just round robin.
Okay, thank you. Just on the point that Mr. Porter just made in terms of how to refer to me, I would recommend as a public official, as an appointed member of the Vermont Climate Council. I'm not here as an advocate, I'm here as an appointed member of the Vermont Climate Council. I would like to raise a concern that I think we should all have in mind as this discussion proceeds. I think everybody agrees with the intent of making as much weatherization and long-lived installed measures happen as soon as possible for the dual benefit of cost savings over time and durable emissions reductions. However, I think we need to be very careful of unintended consequences here in terms of the integrity of the accounting system and not wanting to inadvertently decrease the value of those credits by front-loading them and flooding the market. I think that point has been made well by Councilor Cowart, and I would recommend that he be engaged before any final changes on this are made so that he can express his concerns, because this was looked at very closely by the Clean Heat Working Group. The other thing I would say is that if we front load, weatherization measure could have 25 years of emissions reductions. If you front load all those 25 years into 1 year, it runs the risk of undermining the integrity of the accounting system for being able to meet the 2030 requirements. Because by 2030, you would have actually only gotten 5 years of emissions reductions from that measure, not 25 years. So I think we all agree on the intent. We want to see as much of this action happen as early as possible for cost savings and emissions reduction, but we should be wary of doing something that would undermine the underlying intent of the bill, which is to ensure that the thermal sector is achieving the requirements in relation to the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Okay, so going to the PUC process to make a determination makes sense. Mr. Howard also called me this morning to go over this issue. So what you're saying is very much like the conversation I had. Okay, so I'm going to put a question mark there just because I don't know how you resolve it elsewhere.
Okay, so that is coming up here. So on the bottom of page 16 into page 17, there's edits that talk about eligible clean heat measures, and they're the language that was here previously essentially allowed and made the determination that tier 3 credits can be retired and counted towards the clean heat standard. The language that we proposed here in G has the commission making that determination in how tier 3 and the clean heat standard interact. And again, this is the intent is to give the PUC in designing the program to the latitude to implement the clean heat standard to minimize complexity. There's what I think are resolvable, but there are concerns about the complexity about how tier 3, distribution utilities and obligated entities under the clean heat standard may have customer interactions, may kind of interact in acquiring the clean heat credits and how that plays out for a customer. And so the example that is easy to point to is the time that we had regulated entities both kind of going after the same, right, tier 3 and Efficiency Vermont, both going after heat pumps and wanting to claim those towards their own obligations. And that resolved, and it resolved itself in a PUC, under the rubric of PUC regulation. But it was very complex and it drove costs. It could have delayed implementation. And so this is, again, not being determinative of how tier 3 and clean heat standard could interact. It could interact just as it was proposed, and it could be a different solution, but it leaves it to the PUC to describe, to design that element.
Okay, and so just to make sure, keeping the sites, the cross references, right? So City VSA 209 is our energy efficiency utility statute, right? And
Yep.
City VSA 8005's the res in tier 3.
That's correct.
Okay. Any committee questions on that? Or anyone in the room have a concern about that? Mr. Duval?
I will just note that I provided to the committee testimony on a related concern that was discussed in previous weeks of testimony related to how clean heat credits should be accounted for and the potential interaction with other programs. It is my opinion, speaking for myself, the concern that was raised around accounting is addressed by the bill, and it is really not the issue that others have raised. My concern here would be, so I don't think double counting is an issue. I make that clear in the testimony that I made. I don't think there is any double counting in this bill. I think what this proposed language is trying to get at is, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. McNamara, but the testimony that Mr. McNamara provided earlier about a concern about transfer payments, whereas, and what I want to be clear about is that, again, just speaking for myself, I have not talked with the broader group that has been working on this, is that if we prohibit, and I'm not saying that's the suggestion, that would be a possible recommendation of the PUC, but if you were to prohibit weatherization that's happening by the community action agencies or tier 3 measures that are happening via electric customers from being able to receive tier 3 credits, then what that would be doing is saying that fossil fuel companies should not be paying towards and helping with low-income weatherization or providing extra funding for electrification. I have shared with this committee in the past a graph that says how much cost we're putting on our electricity customers' bills and how little we're putting on the fossil fuel side, and comparatively how much more pollution the fossil fuel sector creates versus the electricity sector. So if we don't allow tier 3 measures, weatherization, to be eligible for clean heat credits, that means less money going to those things, less money going from fossil fuel companies to help provide additional support to our low-income weatherization programs and our electrification efforts. And I think that would be problematic.
And so, and if I can just chime in, I just want to be clear, it's money coming from fossil fuel companies collected by customers.
If they decide to pass that cost on to customers.
Which I cannot imagine any company not passing those costs on to customers. And the overall goal here, I disagree with Mr. Duval. I think rather than trying to decide this, you have the PUC, which is going to have a much more transparent public process specifically around the clean heat standard than anything to date. I think it is most appropriate to allow them to make the decision after lots of input. They make these kind of determinations on programs all the time. I think it's appropriate to give them the authority to make this.
And I'd like to make just one other clarification. The reference in particular here is to the other regulated programs in the state. So Efficiency Vermont programs and the distribution utility programs. it's maybe a small half clarification. It's not necessarily referencing the state's weatherization programs, who are not regulated in the same way as Efficiency Vermont and distribution utilities.
Okay. We're a little, I'm gonna ask if people can stay another, I don't know how much more we need, 10 minutes, maybe less?
I think we're almost done.
Okay, so we'll wrap up shortly. Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
So the remainder of that addition on page 17, the sub provision 1 offers some consideration for the PUC, including the impacts of competition that I was talking about. Subprovision 2 is another provision that, and I've suggested this previously, is considering whether or not we should have a certain requirement for weatherization projects to explicitly ask the PUC to, talk about the benefits and the costs of doing that within the clean heat standard, and leaving open that possibility.
So this is what addresses the earlier section. Well, that's what the CO2 accounting. Okay.
So subprovision 3 is the one that addresses the other section I was talking about. So this is essentially whether or not we should, provision 2 is whether or not we should say X amount of your credits must come from weatherization. Subdivision 3 is that issue of whether the clean heat credit for an installed measure should be claimed in the year it's installed, or whether the annual value of that credit should be applied over the measure life.
And I've inserted an or just where you did when you read it.
I'm sorry?
There's no or on mine, but I just wrote one in.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
I think I said the or.
You did, you did. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Now, the electric
On the
applied over the lifetime.
Right, so considering whether something shall be claimed, its lifetime shall be claimed in year 1, or its lifetime shall be spread across each year that it provides that service.
Which is what we did for back in 2002 for electricity.
Okay, page 21.
Before we get to the 21 page, or it's my page 19, there's a deleted provision 6 here that talks about the technical advisory group and the facilitating the program's coordination with other energy programs. And that was deleted as it would be addressed by the commission in the previous section I talked about on page 17.
I think, I see. My copy was 5.7, so I didn't notice missing 6. Okay, take a look at that later. Thank you.
And I think that we've covered the rest of the changes.
A&R instead of BEC, the date February instead of January or March. And we did those new language on 28. There's part of what's going on there, cost containment, address that idea that 5 years in, we might see that we're not tracking to meet the Paris Agreement or something like that. And then your GWSA, we made that an obligation. What happens? I mean, I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole, but what happens if 5 years in we see that we've controlled costs well, but we're not achieving our climate goals? What do you foresee happening to make adjustments?
Well, under the clean heat standard, under the bill, the PUC sets annual requirements every year. And so if it looks like the trajectory is not it's not obtaining all the GHG emissions that we need, then the PUC can simply increase those requirements. And again, that goes to the point of the cost containment measures do not take primacy over meeting the requirements.
Okay. John McDonald?
What's the general track record of meeting requirements?
All right, so in tier 3, our utilities have met all of their requirements. All right, tiers 1 and 2 of the renewable energy standard as well. The regulated entities have met the requirements. Efficiency Vermont, it has had performance metrics. It's kind of a different way to set requirements. It's not but they get paid if they hit certain targets that the commission sets, and they have not hit 100% of the targets, but they've been very successful. I think maybe hit like 98% of the targets that we've set and gotten close on the other ones. And so been very successful under that performance-based mechanism. So those are two areas anyway that we've been fairly successful.
Okay. So we're all going to recommend cautious optimism.
Efficiency Vermont has a
Good program design.
much better record than Paris.
Okay.
Targets.
Well, so I would like to ask the committee for permission to work with council to integrate edits into a next draft. And then, of course, they'll all be highlighted, but it will be hard for us to do it in person as a group and maintain any kind of schedule. So our members, basically what we just did here today, where Mr. Kowski brought forward a group of edits, all highlighted, and we went over them. Are people on the committee comfortable with me doing that on behalf of the committee for the next draft? Senator McCormick?
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a good way to proceed, but I do want to add another dimension, which is I think there are people who have some standing on these issues, who have been involved, in fact, on the Climate Council, who are feeling excluded from the discussion at this point. We've heard from them as, they've gotten to express their point of view, but what we have now is some people in the room with whom we are writing the language of the bill, and there are other people who are watching on Zoom, and I think they feel excluded with some good reason, and I think very likely have something to offer. So I would hope we would hear again from some of the bill's detractors before we make I wouldn't even necessarily say detractors, people who want to go forward but have issues, particular issues. I, for one, I'm still troubled by the problems with biofuels, with hydro and nuclear, and I wonder if this is can't possibly be made less complicated. We're hearing from people who think it's regressive and undermines businesses. Some people think it's inadequate. Some people think it's excessive. I would like to, at least I'm feeling now that we're shutting some voices out of the discussion. And I know there is a time to do that. You hear from everybody who has something to say, and then you have to finally sit down and develop the language. But, and I also know that we've got a deadline ahead of us. But I think there are people we probably need to hear from. Perhaps might want to be in the room with the people who are in the room.
Well, your point's well taken. I would say, given the timeliness of all the work, and that we have, I think, heard from a broad cross-section of people the last several weeks, I would ask anyone who hears an ongoing concern to write to the committee, and I'll look at opportunities to schedule more testimony, but we are, this is, the nature of editing at the very end.
No, I appreciate that.
Perfect process, but again, we're broadcasting it, anyone who has something to say, please write to the committee directly. Everything that gets sent in gets read. All right. And also, I'm sitting here having had conversations with quite a few people who were not happy with various elements of the bill over the last 72 hours. So I have my own questions, and I hear their voices in my head asking questions as we work. So we'll do our best. Okay, well, with that, then I want to thank everyone for coming in and helping us keep working. With the committee's permission, I'll sit down with Ms. Schakowsky and we'll see another draft. I hope that we can have something tomorrow. My goal would be to see if we can close the loop by Wednesday. I guess the other thing is not to just, this is a really practical question, not a political question, that I would like to know, the committee needs to know if all the issues of concern to the administration have yet been brought to the table. It's my understanding, well, I don't have a clear understanding of that. So we're working in good faith, but I would like to just check in with you. You don't need to respond right this moment, that we've heard everything we need to think about in order basically to build a consensus bill. So if you could check in with your team and see where we are, just make sure that there's not something else out there that hasn't been brought up yet. That would be key to knowing that we're doing all this work together to improve the bill and to be able to move it and count on passing something that becomes law and is enacted, and then we see all the work in progress that we all hope to see. So thank you for that. So I'll check back in with you on that question. And